In 1944, the U.S. Navy fed more than 3.4 million sailors on just 47 cents a man per day. That is barely the price of a fast food snack today, yet it kept an entire fleet fighting across 2 oceans. Every can of corned beef and every sack of powdered eggs had to survive a journey most food never makes. Months of planning, a voyage across an ocean, and up to 90 days at sea before the next resupply. The men who cooked it were not chefs. They were sailors called commissarimen, learning on the job from a thin file called the Navy Standard Recipe Cards. 10 of their dishes fed the fleet through 3 wars and then quietly vanished from memory. And by the end of this video, you will know exactly what was on that tray. To understand why these meals mattered, picture the galley itself. A tin and iron kitchen with steam tables and jacketed kettles, built to feed hundreds without a single fresh vegetable in sight. Every recipe had to survive weeks of unrefrigerated storage in a ship's hold, which meant flavor came second to one thing only: staying edible. Start with the dish sailors hated most and ate more than almost any other. Officially, it was creamed chipped beef on toast, but the crew called it something far less polite, and the Navy still served it constantly through the entire Second World War. The 1944 recipe called for 1 pound of dried chipped beef per 8 men, a roux of flour and rendered fat, and powdered milk reconstituted with whatever fresh water the ship had. Mess cooks bought the beef by the carload from suppliers in Chicago and Kansas City, then simmered it until it turned the texture of wallpaper paste before ladling it over hard toast. The Pacific version was almost always worse than the Atlantic one, because the powdered milk shipped through Lend-Lease often clumped in the kettle, and veterans remember eating this twice a week for an entire deployment. The next dish came out of a can by the tens of millions every single year. Sailors called it corned willy, a mix of cured beef, diced potato, and onion packed in 12 and 16-ounce cans with a 3-year shelf life. Cooks either pan-fried it until the surface crisped on the steel griddle, or broke it into a stew with canned vegetables and ship's biscuits, and its heavy salt content made it a real morale booster in tropical heat. Most of it arrived under the Charles Brand or Armor Star label, shipped through the Naval Supply Center at Oakland for the long haul west, and the same product still appears in today's NAVSUP supply catalog. Fresh eggs simply could not survive more than 3 or 4 days at sea, so the Navy replaced them entirely. Whole eggs were dehydrated and packed in nitrogen-filled tins, each one equal to roughly 2 dozen fresh eggs. And by 1944, America was producing about 200 million pounds of them a year. Mess cooks rehydrated the powder the night before service so the scramble would not turn grainy, and the result was yellower, chalkier, and became the signature dish of any given Tuesday. Larger ships eventually switched to frozen eggs once freezers became standard, but destroyers, submarines, and amphibious craft ran on powdered eggs straight through the war and often into Korea. Now consider the single most important protein in the entire Pacific Fleet. Hormel spam, introduced in 1937, became the subject of the largest processed meat contract in American history up to that point, bought by the Navy in the millions of cans per month. Cooks fried it for breakfast, sliced it into stew, or combined it with rice and canned tomatoes into a dish the crew simply called spam and rice. Sailors even split it into 2 categories: spam with a mission for the real Hormel brand, and spam without a mission for the off-brand luncheon meat that filled the gap once Lend-Lease shipments to Britain absorbed most of Hormel's supply. Mess logs from the USS Essex and USS Enterprise show it on the menu at 4 out of every 7 breakfasts, because unlike almost everything else in the galley, it could be eaten cold straight from the can. One ingredient stretched the meat ration further than anything else on the ship. Canned pork and beans arrived by the caseload, and the mess cook would simply dump a dozen cans into a steam table pan and serve it as a side almost every single dinner. Those same beans became Navy bean soup, simmered for hours with canned tomatoes, dehydrated onions, and salt pork, served in batches large enough for the whole crew roughly once a week. On smaller destroyer escorts, it became a fixed Wednesday tradition, and the recipe survived so well it is still taught today in the Fleet Mess Specialist curriculum at Great Lakes Naval Training Center. When supplies ran thin, this was the meal that kept a crew fed. Salt pork, cured pork belly packed in heavy salt tubs, was the cheapest concentrated fat and protein the Navy could buy in bulk, and cooks often rendered it straight into the kettle as the base fat for whatever else they were making. The actual dish was almost embarrassingly simple: boil water, add potatoes when they were available, drop in cubes of salt pork, and simmer until done. On submarines patrolling the Pacific, this combination, alongside canned onions, became the literal definition of a meal during a long war patrol, appearing again and again in oral histories collected by U.S. submarine veterans of World War II. Not every meal on this list was dreaded, and this one might be the most requested dish in Navy history. Ship's mac used pre-cooked canned elbow macaroni instead of the dry boxed kind, folded into a sauce made from dehydrated cheese powder, the same product Kraft sold commercially from 1937 onward. Ships with an oven ran it under the broiler for a brown top the crew nicknamed Baked Mac, while ships without one served it plain as Steamed Mac, and post-war surveys ranked it above both meatloaf and apple pie as the most requested comfort food in the fleet. This next item predates the entire United States Navy. Hardtack, an unsweetened cracker of flour, salt, and water, had mostly been replaced by soft bread aboard ship, but it still traveled with landing parties and shore detachments as an emergency ration. Marines ashore stretched their sea ration stew with whatever fresh or canned provisions they could scrounge, producing what after-action reports called canteen stews, roughly 60% ration meat and 40% improvised vegetables. Sailors made hardtack edible by crumbling it into stew, soaking it in Spam grease, or crushing it with canned milk and sugar into what veterans still call skipper's pudding. Fresh vegetables were nearly impossible to keep at sea, so the Navy leaned on two dehydrated staples above all others. Dehydrated carrots needed an overnight soak and came out with a dull flavor that cooks masked with brown sugar and butter substitute, while dehydrated peas reconstituted so well they held their shape and folded straight into any stew. Supply officers had to plan vegetable orders up to 12 months ahead, using only the previous year's usage data, just to keep roughly 1 cup of reconstituted vegetable on every man's plate at every meal. And if one image sums up the entire Navy mess system, it is this final dish. The United States military was the largest single buyer of canned fruit on Earth during the war, and canned peaches were the single most purchased item in that entire category. Cooks simply opened a number 10 can and ladled it into a dish, and sailors on long combat cruises would drink the leftover syrup straight when no spoon was handy. Nothing was wasted. Leftover fruit went into the next morning's pancake batter or into a standardized dessert called cobbler, fruit, baked, the dish that best shows how a mess cook could turn stale supplies into something the whole crew lined up for. Behind every one of these 10 dishes sat a supply chain most sailors never saw. The ship's commissary officer wrote the daily menu and signed the requisitions, while naval supply depots at Oakland, Mare Island, Pearl Harbor, and Norfolk coordinated everything from soup to Spam across 2 oceans. Between 1943 and 1945, the Navy perfected underway replenishment, bringing supply ships alongside combat vessels at sea to transfer fuel, ammunition, and fresh provisions in a single pass, while smaller ships often received pallets by helicopter instead. A 1951 Navy study on mess operations credited the entire system to 3 things: written standard recipes for every dish, strict substitution rules for when supplies ran short, and a fierce professional pride inside the commissariman rating itself. By the 1980s, the Navy began contracting out shoreside food service to civilian companies, and the old Navy cookbook recipes quietly disappeared from daily use. Modern sailors eat from an entirely different NAVSUP recipe library with far less canned and dehydrated food, and by every quality of life survey since the late 1990s, the food is simply better. The mess cooks who improvised these 10 dishes through 3 wars have no real modern equivalent, and their recipes now live mostly in veterans' reunion cookbooks rather than on any actual mess deck. So the next time you hear a veteran mention chipped beef on toast or a can of peaches at the end of a meal, you now know exactly what that meant and exactly what it took to get it there. What we have not covered yet is how these same supply lines handled something even harder than food: keeping an entire fleet armed in the middle of the ocean. That story involves a completely different set of ships, a completely different kind of danger, and it explains why the Navy still trains for it today. If 10 forgotten meals could keep 3 wars' worth of sailors fed, imagine what it took to keep them armed at the same time. That is exactly what the next video walks through, from the ships that carried the ammunition to the sailors who moved it by hand in open water. Go watch it next, because once you understand how the Navy fed its sailors, the story of how it armed them will make even more sense.